The wind does not just howl, it screams like a dying animal. Beyond the frozen fjords of 9th century Iceland, a wall of blinding white death drops the temperature to 40 degrees below zero. In the valley below, the proud, towering timber longhouses of the Norse chieftains are groaning. Their wooden beams snap under the crushing weight of the ice. Frost creeps up their interior walls, stealing the breath from the lungs of the men inside. But deep in the shadow of the mountain, buried beneath a frozen shell of dead earth, an outcast sits in absolute silence. No wind pierces his walls. A single tiny hearth fire burns, casting a warm golden glow against a thick, suffocating layer of rotting peat moss. He is not freezing, he is sweating. To the proud warriors and master shipbuilders of his clan, Einar was a fool. When they arrived on these harsh, volcanic shores, the first instinct of the wealthy settlers was to conquer the landscape. They felled the ancient, twisted birch forests. They hauled massive, groaning timbers across the jagged black rocks to build grand halls, desperate to recreate the towering, airy structures of their homeland. They wanted monuments of wood to prove their dominance over the wild. But Einar did not look up at the trees. He looked down at the mud. He understood something the proud chieftains did not. The wind here is a thief, and wood is full of invisible doors. While the others swung heavy iron axes, their muscles straining against the thick trunks, Einar spent his autumn on his hands and knees in the freezing, waterlogged bogs. His hands were stained black with mud, his fingernails cracked and bleeding from tearing up massive, heavy chunks of soaking wet peat moss. The others would walk past his plot and laugh. They pointed their calloused fingers at the deep, dark trench he was carving into the side of a hill. They mocked him for digging a grave for himself before the winter even arrived. Why, they asked, would a free man choose to live like a burrowing rat in a tomb of wet dirt and dead weeds, instead of standing tall in a hall of strong timber? They laughed when he dragged the worthless, rotting moss to his muddy pit. They called him a madman. But they would not be laughing when the sky turned black, and the great white death finally descended upon the valley. The autumn air in 9th century Iceland did not cool gradually. It snapped. The mornings began to carry a sharp, metallic bite that tasted of sea salt and impending frost. The sky, once a pale blue, turned a bruised, heavy gray. Up on the windswept ridges, the chieftains and their thralls were rushing to raise their massive timber frames. The rhythmic, echoing cracks of iron axes biting into dense birchwood rang out across the fjords from dawn until dusk. Heavy wooden mallets pounded massive wooden pegs into thick beams. It was a sound of pride, of men determined to force their will upon a strange and hostile landscape. They wanted to live as they had in Norway, in high vaulted halls filled with smoke and laughter. But down in the valley, in the long shadows of the jagged mountains, Einar worked in total, solitary silence. His weapon was not an axe, but a heavy, broad-bladed iron spade. And his enemy was the earth itself. Einar drove the dull metal edge into the dense, black volcanic soil, putting the entire weight of his leather-clad body behind his heel, just to break the stubborn crust. The ground here was not forgiving. It was packed with sharp, jagged basalt stones and intertwined with ancient, stubborn roots that had clawed their way into the dark dirt for centuries. Each shovelful weighed like heavy lead. The wet, freezing mud clung stubbornly to the iron, forcing Einar to stop every few minutes and scrape the blade clean with his bare, freezing hands. His fingers were permanently stained a deep, bruised purple. The black dirt was embedded so deeply under his cracked nails that his hands throbbed with a dull, constant ache. His wool tunic, damp with cold rain, clung heavy and freezing to his skin. He was digging downward, while the others built toward the sky, seeking to catch the pale, fading autumn sunlight. Einar was carving a wide, rectangular pit deep into the sloping side of a hill. He dug for 14 days straight. He dug until the walls of raw, dark earth rose past his knees, then past his waist, and finally, right past his broad shoulders. The physical labor was sheer agony. Every muscle in his lower back screamed in protest as he squatted to hoist heavy, jagged boulders out of the pit, throwing them over the edge. His heavy breath formed thick, white clouds of mist in the freezing air, disappearing quickly into the biting wind. The salt sweat rolled down his forehead, stinging his eyes, only to freeze into tiny, rigid ice crystals in his thick, matted beard the moment he stopped to rest. Sometimes, men from the settlement would ride past on their sturdy horses. They would look down into the muddy pit, shake their heads at the filthy man covered in mud, and laugh. They thought he had lost his mind to the isolation. But down in this dark hole, wrapped in the damp, pungent smell of raw soil and severed roots, Einar noticed something the arrogant men on the ridges did not. Even as the wind above ground began to howl with ferocity, whipping the dead brown grass into a frenzy and carrying the first biting, stinging flakes of snow, the air at the bottom of the earthen pit was entirely still. There was absolutely no draft. No wind could penetrate the solid mass of the earth. And more importantly, there was a strange, subtle warmth emanating from the deep dirt itself. Einar placed his bare, calloused palm flat against the dark wall of the excavation, pressing his skin into the dirt. The earth was holding a secret. While the air above ground would soon plummet to fatal freezing temperatures, the deep soil maintained a constant, steady memory of warmth, a geothermal baseline that never froze. It was a natural sanctuary. But simply digging a hole was not enough. Einar knew that to survive the coming fury, he needed to wrap this earthen bunker in a massive, impenetrable thermal shield. Einar left the quiet sanctuary of his earthen pit and walked down toward the deadly, freezing marshes. The coastal bogs of Iceland were treacherous. They were a sprawling, flat expanse of black water and decaying vegetation. The water here was close to freezing, topped with a fragile, jagged crust of morning ice. He waded in. The paralyzing cold bit through his thick wool trousers instantly, gripping his calves like an iron vise. He gasped. The shock of the freezing water squeezed his lungs. But he pushed deeper, until the dark, murky water reached his knees. He plunged his bare arms into the freezing depths, feeling blindly through the freezing muck. His fingers found it, the peat, centuries of dead moss, compressed by time and water into dense, heavy mats. He pulled. The bog fought back with a terrible, suctioning slurp. The muscles in his forearms strained, cords of tendons standing out against his pale skin. With a violent heave, he ripped a massive slab of sodden peat moss from the bog. It was impossibly heavy. A single block of wet moss weighed more than a large stone. Water poured from it in thick, dark streams, soaking his tunic, freezing against his chest. But Einar did not drop it. He loaded a wooden sled with block after block of the dripping, brown mass. His back bowed under the immense strain as he dragged the sled back up the hill. The ropes dug deep, burning grooves into his broad shoulders. He dragged the heavy sled through the sharp, dead grass, his boots slipping in the frozen mud, back and forth. Over and over. From dawn until the pale, anemic sun dipped below the jagged black peaks. His hands grew raw. The skin peeled back from his knuckles. Blood mixed with the dark, freezing mud. To the men in the timber longhouses, sitting by their large, roaring fires and drinking warm ale, hauling wet weeds from a frozen swamp, was the ultimate act of a desperate, broke madman. They had massive logs of dense oak and pine to keep the wind out. What could wet dirt possibly do against the wrath of winter? But Einar was not just piling dirt. He was engineering a fortress. Down inside his excavated pit, he began to construct a humble inner skeleton. He did not use the massive, straight trunks of the old-growth forests. He could not afford them, and he did not want them. Instead, he gathered twisted silver driftwood that had washed up on the black sand beaches, wood that had been hardened by the salt in the sea. He scavenged crooked, stunted birch branches. He lashed them together with tough strips of raw leather, forming a low, domed frame. It was small, too small, a chieftain would say. But Einar knew that a massive, vaulted ceiling was a death trap. Warm air rises. In a grand longhouse, the heat from the central fire would drift high up into the rafters, leaving the men below shivering in the freezing drafts. Einar's roof was low, barely tall enough to stand beneath. He wanted to trap every single breath of warmth close to his body. Once the modest wooden skeleton was lashed into place, Einar began the grueling task of building the outer shell. He took the heavy, sodden blocks of peat moss and began stacking them, layer by layer, base to roof. He did not just lay them flat. He wove them together like tightly packed bricks, creating a staggering wall of earth and organic matter, 2 feet thick, then 3 feet thick. He packed the seams with wet mud, ensuring not a single sliver of daylight could pierce the barrier. As he worked, the wind began to shift. The low, howling moan in the distance grew louder, turning into a deep, sustained roar. The gray sky bruised into a violent, suffocating black. The first true storm of the season was breathing down his neck. The walls were finished, rising thick, dark, and impenetrable against the fading afternoon light. But the most dangerous task still remained. Einar had to cover the roof. The stunted, scavenged birch skeleton was incredibly fragile. To lay hundreds of pounds of soaking wet earth directly over his head was a massive, calculated risk. If the thin wood snapped under the crushing weight, he would be buried alive in his own creation, crushed by the very earth meant to save him. But he had no choice. The storm was coming. He began dragging the dense, dripping mats of turf up the sloping, muddy walls. His worn leather boots slipped constantly. He fell hard to his knees in the freezing mud, his cold breath rasping in his tight chest like dry, crinkled leaves. He pushed himself up, his muscles burning. He hoisted the heavy, dripping slabs onto the low roof frame, one agonizing lift at a time. He laid the first thick layer grass side down, making sure the tough, fibrous roots were directly interlocking with the bare twigs of the birch branches. Then, he laid a second, even heavier layer grass side up. This was the ancient, forgotten way. As the roots grew over time, they would knit together in the dark, turning the roof into a single, living, breathing organism. A solid, immovable dome of earth. Up high, the men on the ridges were desperately sealing their grand timber longhouses with thick, sticky pine pitch. They believed entirely in hard, unyielding barriers, solid wood and hardened resin. But Einar believed in the power of dead air. The peat moss he was hauling was not just heavy, useless dirt. Underneath its wet, slimy, decaying surface, it was a complex, microscopic labyrinth. It held millions upon millions of tiny, empty cells left behind by the rotting moss. When the brutal deep freeze finally hit, these endless, microscopic pockets of air would act as an invisible, hyper-efficient thermal shield. Cold cannot easily penetrate dead air. Einar's thick earthen walls would stubbornly refuse to let the precious, meager warmth of his body escape into the freezing night. Simultaneously, this massive 3-foot-thick sponge of earth would stop the biting wind chill dead in its tracks. But right now, inside the unfinished mound, there was absolutely no warmth. There was only the agonizing, biting cold. His lips were deeply cracked and bleeding, filling his mouth with the sharp, warm taste of copper and salt. His exhausted muscles trembled violently with severe, uncontrollable fatigue. The temperature in the valley was dropping incredibly fast. The deep puddles of muddy water around his boots were freezing solid in mere minutes, snapping and crunching under his heavy weight like brittle, shattered glass. The pale sky above the jagged fjords had completely vanished. It was rapidly swallowed by a swirling, suffocating canopy of dark, violent gray clouds. The wind no longer moaned softly. It roared with the deafening, terrifying sound of a massive, crashing waterfall. High up on the exposed, freezing ridges, the chieftains hurriedly locked their heavy oak doors. They barred them with thick iron rods and frantically stoked their massive central fires until the flames leaped high. They felt secure, insulated by their wealth and their towering walls of imported timber. Down in the dark, shadowed valley, Einar placed the final, heavy slab of freezing moss over the narrow entrance tunnel. He dropped to the freezing mud and crawled inside his low, dark earth mound on his bruised hands and bleeding knees. The smell of wet soil, decaying roots, and crushed grass was overwhelmingly thick in the cramped space. He pulled a heavy, rough-hewn wooden door shut behind him, sealing the narrow entrance completely. He jammed a thick, heavy piece of scavenged driftwood against the wooden boards, locking himself inside the suffocating, pitch-black darkness. The deafening, terrifying roar of the wind outside was instantly muted. It was immediately reduced to a dull, distant vibration, trembling softly through the deep, silent earth. He was finally buried. Out of mile. But the true test had not even begun. The air inside the dark mound was biting cold, matching the temperature of the freezing mud. Einar knelt in the pitch black, his heart pounding against his ribs, waiting for the fury of the white death to strike. Inside the sealed mound, the darkness was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating blackness that pressed violently against Einar's eyes, thick with the sharp scent of crushed roots, damp clay, and his own freezing sweat. The cold radiating from his wet clothing was agonizing. His teeth chattered uncontrollably, snapping together with a harsh, frantic rhythm. He could hear his own heartbeat, a slow, sluggish thud echoing in the tight, claustrophobic space. His frozen fingers, stiff and entirely numb, fumbled blindly in the pitch black for his heavy iron striker and a small piece of jagged flint. He struck them together. A single, brilliant orange spark illuminated his hollow, exhausted face for a fraction of a second before dying instantly in the damp, freezing air. He struck again and again. The sharp, metallic clack, clack, clack was the only sound in the buried room, a desperate prayer in the dark. Finally, a tiny, glowing ember caught onto a delicate nest of dried, papery birch bark he had hoarded deep within his tunic. Einar leaned in close, bringing his cracked, bleeding lips to the fragile orange glow. He blew gently, offering a slow, steady stream of breath. A thin gray ribbon of smoke curled upward, carrying the sweet, sharp scent of burning wood. The flame blossomed, small but fierce, casting long, dancing shadows against the raw, uneven walls of packed earth and exposed, twisted roots. Einar did not build a roaring bonfire. A massive fire would consume all the precious oxygen in the tightly sealed chamber and dry out the inner layer of the turf too quickly, causing the delicate earthen ceiling to crumble and collapse on his head. Instead, he fed the flame with tiny, finger-thick twigs of scavenged driftwood, building a modest, highly controlled hearth fire no larger than his two-cupped hands. He hovered his raw, bruised palms over the tiny flames, desperate to absorb every ounce of the radiant energy. In a grand, high-roofed timber longhouse, a fire this small would be utterly useless against the freezing drafts. It would be swallowed instantly by the massive, cavernous volume of frigid air. But inside the cramped, low-ceilinged turf house, something miraculous began to happen. The heat did not escape. It rose slowly, hitting the low canopy of interwoven birch branches and thick, wet peat. Instead of leaking out into the freezing night, the warm air was gently pushed back down, circulating softly around Einar's shivering body. The millions of microscopic pockets of dead air trapped inside the massive 3-foot-thick walls of rotting moss acted like a heavy, invisible wool blanket. They swallowed the meager heat of the fire and stubbornly refused to let it go. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the biting, fatal chill in the damp room began to recede, replaced by a dense, stable pocket of breathable warmth. Above ground, the world was ending. The true, terrifying fury of the White Death finally crested over the jagged mountain peaks. It was not just a heavy snowfall. It was an apocalyptic avalanche of blinding white ice crystals, driven by winds so fierce they tore the dead, frozen grass directly from the hardened topsoil. The temperature plummeted rapidly to a catastrophic 40 degrees below zero. Up on the exposed, windswept ridges, the arrogant chieftains realized their fatal mistake. The wind shrieked like a choir of dying animals, slamming into the flat, rigid broadsides of the timber longhouses. The massive oak walls, built to project strength and dominance, stood defiantly against the gale, taking the full, devastating force of the blizzard upon their flat surfaces. The wood groaned and shrieked under the immense, crushing pressure. But worse than the howling wind was the insidious, creeping cold. The freezing air found every microscopic crack, every shrinking seam between the wooden logs. It sliced through the timber like invisible, icy daggers, instantly dropping the temperature inside the grand halls. The chieftains piled massive, heavy logs onto their central fires, but the blistering heat was immediately sucked up into the high, vaulted ceilings, leaving the men below shivering violently as thick, white frost began to rapidly climb up the interior walls. Down in the valley, Einar sat perfectly still in the dim, golden light of his tiny hearth. He listened to the muffled, distant, rhythmic thumping of the earth above him. The massive, suffocating weight of the accumulating snow was burying his turf house entirely, sealing it beneath feet of dense, heavy ice. To anyone looking from the outside, the mound had completely vanished into the swirling white wasteland. He was buried alive in a tomb of snow and dead earth. The ultimate test of his bizarre, ancient thermal barrier was now upon him. The storm did not break after one night. It did not break after a week. For 21 agonizing, sunless days, the White Death held the jagged coast of Iceland by the throat. The wind screamed with a relentless, mechanical fury. It carried millions of tons of hard, crystalline ice, blasting it horizontally against the black mountainsides. Above Einar, the snow piled higher and higher. 3 feet, 6 feet, 10 feet of dense, heavy white powder completely buried his small earthen mound. The sheer, crushing weight of the snowpack was a terrifying presence in the dark. In the silent, subterranean room, Einar lay on his back, staring up at the low ceiling of twisted birch branches. He listened to the wood groaning under the immense strain. Every creak sent a sharp spike of cold panic through his chest. If the scavenged branches snapped, tons of freezing snow and wet earth would crush him in an instant. But the fragile wood did not break. The roots of the inverted peat moss had already begun to freeze and lock together in the dark, forming a rigid, unbreakable arch of solid earth. Einar was entirely entombed, yet he was completely safe. And slowly, a profound change occurred inside the dark, cramped space. The walls of damp mud and rotting moss stopped sapping the heat. They began to absorb it. The tiny, flickering hearth fire had burned steadily for days. The thick, dark soil soaked up the gentle warmth, baking it deep into the dense walls. Einar stripped off his heavy, ice-crusted outer tunic. His bare skin glistened with a thin layer of sweat in the dim golden light. He was warm. But high above him, on the exposed and windswept ridges, a slow, agonizing tragedy was unfolding. The grand timber longhouses were failing. The wealthy chieftains and their proud warriors huddled together, shivering uncontrollably beneath massive piles of heavy animal furs. Their monumental walls of imported oak and pine, a symbol of their dominance, were bowing to the brutal physics of the deep freeze. Wood is porous. When subjected to extreme, sustained cold timber contracts, it violently shrinks. Across the grand halls, microscopic gaps between the heavy logs began to widen into dangerous, gaping cracks. They popped and snapped with sounds like breaking bones. The howling, 50-mile-per-hour winds found these invisible doors. The gale forced its way inside, carrying blinding white streams of powdered snow directly into the living quarters. The drafts were a relentless barrage of invisible icy blades. The men desperately fed their massive central fires, burning through their precious winter woodpiles at a terrifying, panicked rate. But it was entirely useless. The blistering heat from the roaring flames rushed straight up into the high, vaulted timber ceilings. The freezing drafts swept mercilessly across the lower floors, stealing the warmth before it could touch their freezing bodies. A thick, white layer of frost began to coat the inside walls, turning quickly into a heavy glaze of solid ice. Water froze solid inside their drinking horns. The very air inside the great halls turned into a biting, deadly mist. The proud men watched in absolute terror as their breath fell to the floor in heavy white clouds. Their grand monuments had become giant, wooden freezers. They did not understand the quiet, rustic science that was keeping the mocked outcast alive down in the valley. Einar was relying on the ancient, forgotten physics of the earth. By burying his home half underground, he tapped directly into a massive, subterranean thermal battery. The deep soil beneath the frost line holds a constant geothermal memory. It maintains a steady temperature, lingering stubbornly around 10 degrees Celsius, even when the world above is a frozen, deadly wasteland. The earth itself was Einar's baseline furnace, but the true genius was the peat moss. To the chieftains, it was just wet, worthless dirt. But on a microscopic level, rotting moss is a chaotic, intricate labyrinth. It is composed of millions upon millions of tiny, hollow plant cells. These empty cells act as perfect, invisible pockets of dead air. When the killing cold tried to pierce Einar's walls, it hit this massive 3-foot-thick sponge of trapped air and simply stopped. Cold cannot efficiently travel through still air. The peat moss had an incredibly low thermal conductivity. It was an impenetrable, hyper-efficient shield. It completely blocked the violent wind chill from entering, while simultaneously trapping the rising warmth from the tiny hearth fire and Einar's own body heat. Furthermore, the massive layer of snow burying the mound did not make it colder. It added a secondary, heavily insulated blanket over the roof, sealing off the outside world entirely. Inside his earthen cocoon, a gentle, looping heat cycle maintained a steady, life-saving pocket of warmth, completely isolated from the apocalypse above. Finally, on the 22nd day, the screaming wind began to die. The terrifying roar faded into a low, haunting whistle, and then, slowly, into an absolute, deafening silence. Down in the dark mound, Einar noticed the change in the atmospheric pressure. The deep, heavy vibrations in the earth had completely stopped. He stood up, his muscles stiff but deeply warm. He wrapped his heavy wool tunic around his broad shoulders and unbarred the thick wooden door. When he pulled it open, he was not met with daylight. He was met with a solid, impassable wall of dense, packed snow. The massive drift had completely buried his entrance tunnel. Einar grabbed his heavy iron spade. He began to dig. He carved a narrow, claustrophobic tunnel upward through the heavy snowpack, his warm breath misting heavily in the freezing white shaft. He dug for hours, his arms burning with the intense effort, cutting step by step toward the surface. Finally, the iron blade of his spade pierced the top crust. A blinding, searing beam of pure, brilliant sunlight flooded down into the dark tunnel. Einar pushed his way out. He staggered onto the surface of a completely transformed world. The entire valley was a smooth, unbroken ocean of glittering white. The air was perfectly still, incredibly crisp, and bitingly cold in his lungs. He shielded his eyes from the blinding glare, breathing in the sharp, clean air. He had survived. He looked up toward the high, jagged ridges. Slowly, small, dark figures began to emerge from the towering snowdrifts around the great halls. The survivors. They staggered down the mountain slopes, moving with the sluggish, trembling gait of men who had looked death directly in the face. Their faces were hollow, pale, and gaunt. Their lips were severely cracked and blue from the agonizing cold. They had burned almost all of their scavenged wood just to survive the nights. Many had lost toes and fingers to the creeping frostbite. As they descended into the valley, they looked toward Einar's plot. They fully expected to find the outcast frozen solid, a stiff, dead corpse buried inside a collapsed grave of wet mud. But as they waded through the waist-deep snow, they stopped dead in their tracks. A wide circle of snow directly above Einar's roof had completely melted away, revealing the dark, steaming earth underneath. A thin, steady, peaceful ribbon of gray smoke curled upward from the small chimney hole into the crystal blue sky. And standing in the blinding white snow, looking perfectly healthy, deeply warm, and entirely unbothered, was the outcast they had so viciously mocked. The shivering chieftains stared in stunned, breathless silence. The grand, expensive timber longhouses had nearly frozen them to death. The wet, worthless dirt had saved him. They did not laugh at Einar anymore. They stood frozen in the snow, staring at the gentle, rising steam of the moss-covered mound, humbled by the forgotten genius of the earth. The wind no longer howls. The jagged black rocks of the Icelandic coast sit in a profound, heavy, unbroken silence. The great white death has finally passed, leaving behind a fundamentally altered, glittering white world. Up on the windswept, freezing ridges, the towering timber longhouses stand as beautiful frozen monuments to human arrogance. Their massive oak beams are entirely coated in a thick, unyielding armor of hard ice. Inside, the proud chieftains sit shivering, wrapped tightly in heavy, frost-covered animal furs. They nurse their blue, frost-bitten hands in quiet, deeply humbled contemplation. They survived the cataclysm, but the biting cold has permanently broken their pride. They had learned a terrifying, near-fatal lesson about the brutal reality of this untamed volcanic frontier. You cannot conquer the shrieking wind with sheer, blind force. You cannot beat back the killing cold simply by building grand, expensive walls of imported dead wood. Down in the shadowed valley, the outcast returns to his dark, quietly steaming mound of earth. The thick, low-slung turf house does not look like a grand palace. It looks like a simple, ugly scar carved deeply into the frozen mud. But inside that dark, earthen womb, it holds the greatest luxury of the ancient, freezing world. Absolute, unyielding, life-saving warmth. Einar's survival was not a stroke of blind luck, nor was it a miracle of the gods. It was a profound, calculated, and brilliant mastery of primitive physics. He understood deeply that the earth beneath his feet is not just dead dirt, it is a massive, living, thermal shield. He saw the invisible, microscopic, life-saving architecture hidden inside a handful of rotting, soaking wet peat moss. Our ancestors were not primitive. They were not ignorant men stumbling blindly through the dark ages. They possessed a deep, visceral, and highly technical understanding of the natural world that we have long since forgotten. They did not have artificial insulation, electric heaters, or digital thermostats, but they had an intimate, unbroken connection to the raw, uncompromising mechanics of survival. they observed the microscopic secrets of the freezing bogs. They understood the ancient, geothermal memory of the deep soil, and they respected the brutal physics of the winter drafts. Today, we live in tall, fragile towers of glass, steel, and concrete. We believe with absolute certainty that we are completely insulated from the raw, terrifying fury of the natural world. We laugh at the rustic ways, just as the arrogant men on the ridges laughed at a lonely man digging a grave in the mud. But when the modern, fragile power grid eventually fails, and the glowing screens go entirely dark, the ancient cold will inevitably return. It will creep slowly through the tiny cracks in our modern walls, demanding the ultimate respect. Will we know how to survive its bite? Will we remember the ancient, hidden science of the deep earth? The brilliant secrets of our ancestors are still out there, buried quietly in the mud, hiding in the forgotten pages of history, waiting patiently for those who are willing to listen. If you want to unearth more of these lost survival codes, if you want to discover the rustic science that kept humanity alive through the absolute darkest, coldest centuries, leave a like on this video. Subscribe to join us on this continuous journey into the shadowed past. Do not let these ancient, flickering fires burn out in the dark. Stay warm, stay deeply curious, and we will see you in the very next storm.